I was on the US News and World Report looking at the tabs of the page. They had things like news, best countries, best states, healthiest communities, opinion, elections, etc. Okay, that's normal. But then you get to the tab, the racial divide. Why would racial division merit its own ongoing tab? Like dividing the country has suddenly become institutionalized. Race baiting as clickbait. Speaking of race baiting, the media has been given its marching orders, as we've reported before, to divide us by race so that they can distract us from historical economic inequalities between rich and poor that might culminate in a class war rather than a race war. Racial division is not a threat to the system, which is why it's being promoted. The wealthy get us to fight each other rather than fighting them, which is why the Occupy Wall Street movement terrified the 1% back in 2011. After that, a new strategy was deployed to ramp up racial tension to get factions of the working class to fight each other. It was then that the media turned on a dime and started promoting the idea of white supremacy, white privilege, critical race theory, and so forth. Like a switch had been thrown. They wanted Americans to be obsessed with race real bad. For instance, in my feed, the algorithm handed me up an article about a random black man beating on a 91-year-old Asian woman in San Francisco. I wasn't looking for an article like this, but the algorithm wanted me to see it really badly. Likewise with the recent Tyree Nichols coverage from Memphis, where 5 black cops beat a black citizen to death at a traffic stop. In seeing this manipulation, it occurred to me what fake news is. Well, let's start at what fake history is, since news is the first draft of history. In Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind, he has a section entitled Universal History. In it, he talks about how history has an arc, a pattern. There's a system underlying it. That aspect of his conceptualization reminded me of Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems. In it, she talks about the importance of pattern recognition. The cultivated mind thinks in systems. The uncivilized mind regards reality much as an animal does, as a series of random events. Meadows says that this is why the evening news is worthless, because it merely gives you out-of-context occurrences without illuminating the underlying systems that made them happen. Likewise, history, like the evening news, can be written to show you the underlying events, or designed to distract you with flashy colors and twinkling lights to get you to not pay attention to the actual causal agents or actions. Hegel, like Donella Meadows, praises historians who think in systems, who see the larger patterns underlying events, and who understand the deeper mechanisms. Hegel, however, excoriates those historians, who he considers fake historians, who instead of going deeper and showing you the underlying systems, instead veer off into arbitrary anecdotes that don't really illuminate how history happens. Instead, they'll concentrate on some fringe figure instead of showing you the principles of the agents involved. Kind of like how Common Core history books spend more time on ex-slave Harriet Tubman than on George Washington. Moved by their social justice theories, these fake historians, as Hegel would see them, neglect the actual men who drove and shaped the historical period and instead focus inordinate attention on an irrelevant figure. Regardless of her otherwise commendable traits, whether Harriet Tubman lived or died wouldn't have changed early American history one iota. Whether George Washington lived or died, by contrast, would have changed everything. So to neglect Washington and to draw inordinate amounts of attention to Harriet Tubman would, to Hegel, be an example of fake history. It shows you events out of context, randomly, like how the animal experiences consciousness. Think of it this way. Imagine someone trying to teach you about the Roman Empire, and they never taught you about the senators or philosophers or the fact that it had certain institutions, political systems, and instead they concentrated on an irrelevant provincial figure who made bread and told you that this guy, Sextus, made really wonderful, tasty bread. Would you really feel like you knew anything about the Roman Empire? Egyptian history. Imagine if somebody tried to teach you about the Egyptians and never taught you about the pyramids or the pharaohs or hieroglyphics, and instead they just concentrated on a really wonderful janitor who mopped the floors really well. Would you actually be educated in Egyptian history? Likewise in America, there are real influencers, movers and shakers like the Federal Reserve or billionaire oligarchs setting policy. Instead, they want you concentrating on Jamal, who picked 14 bushels of wheat in 1832 and was left-handed. This is fake history. It's a distraction method. There are real events happening right now before your eyes, but like a cat with a laser light, they want you paying attention to the laser darting across the wall, and they don't want you to be able to think in systems. They want you to have the unfocused, out-of-context consciousness of a savage or an animal. And now let's veer back to the article about the 91-year-old Asian lady who was pummeled by the African American. Will the Asian lady ever affect my life? Does the black man's reprehensible behavior shed light on why my groceries are so much more expensive, or why the dollar may be in jeopardy internationally? No, these are fringe irrelevancies, and that's how you can discern fake news. Does it show you something that affects you, something that's rooted in the deeper systems of society, or is it designed to distract you with the anecdotal, the flashy, the irrelevant? We live in a world filled with fear and intimidation so that the truth won't be spoken. Presented by The New American, The Ben Armstrong Show says the things that others are afraid to say. Find information and truth to arm yourself against the lies. Watch every weekday on thenewamerican.com.